Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor Jon V. Kofas is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello everyone, welcome. This is an analytical session on the meeting between the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, and President Donald Trump on 21st May 2025. This has captured the world press attention, media attention, social media attention, largely because of the theatrics in the Oval Office, namely the manner by which supposedly the South African president was caught off guard, shown photographs and video of what the United States government calls white genocide in South Africa. Obviously, genocide is a very specific term. It, according to the Geneva Convention 1949, has a very specific meaning. If there were, of course, white genocide, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, as well as the mainstream media all over the world, putting aside the far right-wing media, because they of course do go along with the myth that there is white genocide. They would have been, the international organizations, in other words, of the United Nations, would have been on this story. There would have been, South Africa would have been brought before The Hague, the World Court. The question, of course, here is beyond the theatrics, beyond what happened at the Oval Office, beyond the rhetoric on both sides, and especially beyond the issue of what seems to divide the United States and South Africa. There are larger structural issues, especially considering that there are many dimensions to this for the United States, as well as South Africa. By the way, the fact is that the President of South Africa, Ramaphosa, knew exactly what he was walking into. Donald Trump had made it clear, as well as Elon Musk, his major financial contributor in 2024, that they believed there was racial discrimination in South Africa, institutional discrimination against the minority Afrikaners, the white minority. Now, there are some dimensions I want to mention. There are a lot of them. This is a very complex issue. I have a particular interest in this issue because both the United States and South Africa are part of the neoliberal model. They are both within the perimeters of neoliberalism. And I happen to believe that the core of the differences between the White House and the US government, I should say, and South Africa, at the core, there are many peripheral issues, is the fact that Donald Trump and his administration want an authoritarian neoliberal government in South Africa, and all the other issues of racialism, of white genocide accusations, the mythology around that, are used in essence to distract and to have South Africa pursue the model of authoritarian neoliberalism, as does the United States currently under this particular president, India, Russia to some degree with variations, Turkey, Hungary, when Jair Bolsonaro was president of Brazil back then. So this was, in my view, at the core of it, and we'll discuss some of it. And it's interesting that both South Africa and the United States do operate within that model. So the question is, what are the difference? What are the dimensions? Why did the President of the United States find it so necessary to do what, in my view, incorrectly, the mainstream press media from around the world called an ambush? There was no ambush. Ramaphosa fully knew, he knew what to expect. He didn't know exactly the particulars of what was going to be shown. He had to chuckle when he did finally see. In any case, part of all this is ideological. The fact is, Donald Trump was a businessman turned politician, and he came into a political party, namely the Republican Party, converted it gradually. He found a lot of fertile ground there of far right elements with the Tea Party movement from 2010 and thereafter. And so he cultivated all of that and institutionalized an authoritarian neoliberal model to the degree that he did in the first term, and then continued to do so in the second. And this, of course, is not the doing of Donald Trump alone. When you look at the think tanks and the Wall Street corporations behind Donald Trump, and specific advisors and their links to Wall Street, what you find is that there is a very broad movement to take the United States toward authoritarian neoliberalism. Just a very brief summary. Neoliberalism, the antecedents, historical antecedents to this go back to the Jimmy Carter administration, late 1970s. It really gets institutionalized in the 1980s and takes off in the 1990s. It does mean, by the way, abandoning the Keynesian economic model that had been in force from the 1930s, from the FDR era, called New Deal, of course, and there were constant revisions to Keynesianism. Keynesian policies of a vibrant social welfare state and a social safety net. Although John Maynard Keynes was not alone in advocating this, there were others, by the way, but very quickly the Keynesian model was pursued, namely that the state is itself a factor in stimulating economic growth, in helping to manage the economy, into setting up institutions, both national and international. For example, the United States set up the Bretton Woods system, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. So you have basically a very active, vibrant role of the state in managing the economy. Now, by the 1980s, when it starts, like I said, the antecedents with Jimmy Carter, we have the slow conversion of the social welfare state and social safety net weakened substantially, and the strengthening of what we call the corporate welfare state under a system where the state becomes the pillar to support the private sector, to support the markets. And the state increasingly falls under the considerable influence of the markets, to the degree that the markets determine policy of the state, everything from fiscal policy, that is tax policy. And we do see, for example, that tax rates, not just in the United States, falling from the 70s during the Eisenhower period to the 20s, in the low 20s under Obama and Trump. We see this on a world scale. So tax fiscal policy is one area. Privatization of public assets is another. And we have also the considerable regimentation of the working class, especially trade unions, in an open class warfare by the neoliberal elites against organized labor, against the working class, and against the middle class. And we have transfer of wealth through corporate subsidies, whether it's in research and development or providing a variety of incentives in everything from guaranteed loans to export subsidies and so forth to corporations. So there is enormous transfer of income from the bottom up in the last 45 years or so under neoliberalism. This obviously takes place in the United States, but it actually is a world system. It starts in England. The experiment before that was in Chile and then Augusto Pinochet. And so we have basically a neoliberal model flourishing. The neoliberal model, interestingly enough, is coincides. Its flourishing in the 1990s, globalization, coincides with the end of the apartheid regime. Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and then in 1994, he becomes president until 1999. So during the period of the President Carter's term, Nelson Mandela was in office. I'm sorry, not Carter, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton. So Clinton and Mandela were in office simultaneously. Bill Clinton, by the way, although he was not a Republican, was a diehard neoliberal. The Democrats converted to neoliberalism as much as the Republicans. They too believe in low taxes for the rich, basically weakening the social safety net, social welfare. So interestingly enough, this is a very important point to make. South Africa, which ends the exploitative regime, the repressive regime of apartheid, of many centuries of colonization, since the 16th century, by the way, the Dutch, the English, the French, Germans in South Africa, seizing the land and the assets of the native people and subjecting them to work there in this otherwise very rich land of minerals and agricultural products, and then ruling a tiny percent of the population, ruling over the vast majority. This ends politically. So there was a political revolution with Nelson Mandela of the African National Congress, the ANC, who had been imprisoned by the whites in South Africa. And then he was allowed to run for office, and the ANC came to power. The African National Congress came to power. However, the Nelson Mandela regime, and specifically the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was involved in this controversy, did not end the social status quo and the economic status quo. There was no social revolution in South Africa. There was no economic revolution. The status quo was preserved. So the 7 to 8% roughly of the white population in South Africa retained its economic privileges. And that is true to this day, by the way. So yes, it's true. The blacks received finally political rights, and there was a black majority rule. But the social structure remains the same. and South Africa remained within the neoliberal global model. This meant that the state in South Africa also weakened the Keynesian social safety net and social welfare programs in a country that badly needed, if any country needed Keynesian economics, it was South Africa, by the way. All African countries, but South Africa, especially because of the apartheid conditions where there was enormous poverty, and I'll give you some statistics up to this day. So you have a huge percent of the population impoverished. And what do? They go along with the neoliberal model, strengthen the private sector, largely in the hands of whites. There are some blacks, by the way. Ramaphosa himself has and his wife happened to be very wealthy. Ramaphosa is, in fact, one of the wealthiest blacks in South Africa. His wife and her family even wealthier. But those are very few exceptions. The overwhelming majority languishes in poverty. So the question here is, what happened in South Africa other than a political revolution? And symbolically, of course, this is very important because this is the land of various tribes, obviously, that were there long before the whites, that they felt finally empowered. Okay, they had the government, but the government worked for the white elites, and the government under the neoliberal model used the institutions to strengthen those economic elites. Unfortunately, the situation, because the situation did not improve for the black majority, there were various schemes about land reform as well as expropriation. One of the issues at the White House meeting that Trump brought up, and he had brought it up in 2018 as well, and Elon Musk had brought this up, was the issue of the land expropriation. Now, it just so happens that the vast majority of the land is in the hands of that 7 to 8% of the white population. And the only thing that the expropriation measure, the Expropriation Act, called for is for land not used, laying fallow, in other words, uncultivated, not of any use to anyone, be expropriated and then given to blacks. For which, by the way, expropriation in this case, the term expropriation, you may be thinking, well, that means that the owner doesn't receive compensation. Actually, the owner does receive compensation. So the issue of a social revolution never taking place was one that haunted the African National Congress, the government to this day, from Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was a very charismatic figure, a figure beyond, like a legend, if you will, beyond any specific policy. And there was such an enthusiasm that finally there was black majority rule, and that people were willing to imagine that down the road there would be, in fact, equitable distribution of resources and income redistribution, which was badly needed in South Africa. That never happened. And 82% of the population, which is black, versus 7-8%, which is white, The 82% of the population, which is black, owned only a tiny percent of both the land and the assets, the income in the country. And the issue at the White House was, with Trump, was that the government should have never gone the route of expropriating. Another issue that came up was, and this was something that Elon Musk, who by the way is South African, complained about. And this is the issue of the government forcing companies to come in. By the way, there are over 600 American companies, everything from IBM to General Electric, McDonald's. There are 600, around 600 companies in South Africa. This is not a country that is hostile to foreign investment, especially American investment. So you have a lot of companies there. Now, there are conditions for coming in South Africa, as there are in other countries, China, for example, India. In South Africa, one of the conditions with Musk was the South African government wanted Musk to accept 30% of the company that he would set up in South Africa to be black owned or have 30% black involvement. So as to integrate the black population, more of the black population into the capitalist system. This idea is not so strange, if you will, considering that the United States government, from, I don't want to say from Roosevelt, although there were some attempts, but especially from Kennedy to Johnson onwards, there were Congress had legislation of, at least for contracts, federal contracts were given to minority owners and so forth. So the idea of integrating into the capitalist system more of the minority population is hardly new. European countries had this. Musk resented that. He didn't want to be told how that there would be blacks involved in the company. He wanted to pursue investing in South Africa without such restrictions. So this issue is also one that Trump embraced as well. Now, on May 21st, when Cyril Ramaphosa met with Trump, there was the aura at that meeting that was reminiscent of the earlier meeting that President Trump had with President Zelensky of Ukraine, which wound up in a shouting match. Now, Ramaphosa, I should tell you, by the way, is viewed in Africa and actually internationally as a very smooth politician, very diplomatic, very sort of silky politician. He laughs off things. He keeps his demeanor cool. He does not shout. He doesn't. He did express anger, but in a very subtle way when he made a sarcastic remark to President Trump, telling him, "I'm sorry, I didn't have a plane to give you," in reference to the Qatar offer of an airplane to the United States government or to Trump personally, whatever that turns out to be. The motive of the president could be, the motives have been discussed in the mainstream media at length. Clearly, the president of the United States has a domestic popular base, and he was appealing to that domestic popular base. He was clearly trying to basically tell the conservative and right wing, and even some Cold War liberals, that this is the country, let's remember, that led the charge against Israel before the International Court of Justice, bringing a case of genocide. So now we are going to turn the tables on them. We're going to tell them they committed suicide. They committed genocide, not suicide. They committed genocide. Now, of course, the problem was that the president offered a video that I believe, according to the BBC, the video was shot in the Congo. It has nothing to do with South Africa. Now, with regard to the crosses, especially along the roadways and in farms, I have to tell you something as a historian, and especially someone who studied extensively the Christian Middle Ages. The crosses in Europe historically have been used as monuments, and throughout, since the Middle Ages, throughout history, Europeans have used crosses to indicate, to preserve the memory of someone who died, either in an accident or who was killed. And this is, those crosses were not, by the way, burial places at all. So the photographs and the video, CNN was right when they questioned the White House press secretary, who provided all this evidence to the president, and were they fact-checked? Did someone bother to look at this? That wasn't the issue. The issue here for the White House was to make an impression on the public just at that moment. It was just for that moment to make the impression. But the fact is that there is no, that is nonsense, because although South Africa, it is true, has one of the worst murder rates in the world. It has one of the worst crime rates in the world. And it is true that some Afrikaners, African farmers, used to be called Boers, Dutch farmers, in other words, some have been killed. The motive has never been genocide. The motive has been theft. The motive is unrelated to the broader definition of what the United Nations calls genocide. The Trump administration, however, wanted to make a few points against South Africa, and these points were actually made even during the Biden administration. When the South Africans brought the case against Israel on genocide, and the court, the International Court of Justice ruled the way that it did, it really bothered the United States, because there were all kinds of implications, especially in many parts of the world, in the press in many parts of the world, because, that the United States was involved in the genocide, considering it supplied weapons and money and aid to Israel. So what we have here is a situation where indirectly the United States felt very awkward about South Africa. So this is not just the Trump administration. This is also the Biden administration that was not exactly happy with the Ramaphosa government with regard to this issue on genocide. Now, there was also the question of the Jewish community in South Africa, and the American Jewish community especially, and the Israeli government, that were making a great deal of noise about South Africa being anti-Semitic. In fact, there were some Jewish organizations that labeled South Africa as one of the most anti-Semitic countries in the world. I believe they listed Poland as one of those as well. And so what we have is the idea that South Africa was pursuing anti-Semitism. So Trump was playing to the base, the right-wing base, but he was also playing to the pro-Israeli side, and he was also trying to send a signal to Africa that the United States would not stand for anyone uh, defying it, that is the U.S. or its allies like Israel. And let's remember that South Africa is a member of BRICS, by the way, and the number one trading partner of South Africa is China. So this was also a jab at China. Now the question is, why did Ramaphosa go to Washington D.C.? Why did the president of South Africa go to Washington D.C.? Considering he knew what to expect, because as early as 2018, Donald Trump and the United States government at that time, many in the administration, had made it very clear that South Africa and the African continent itself ought to be more integrated with the United States, with China. They made it very clear that the United States had a rightful role, sort of carrying out the legacy of the European colonial era in South Africa. Although, in point of fact, it is China that's the number one trading partner in Africa. It is China that is building Africa's infrastructure. This is not to, by the way, to argue that China is doing humanitarian work in Africa. China is doing business in Africa. But that's just the point. China is doing business in Africa. It's doing trade. It's building roads, infrastructure, factories. It's working on securing more minerals for its factories in China. So what it's doing is focused on economic integration of Africa with China. The U.S., on the other hand, is more interested in the geopolitical aspect of Africa. It considers Africa more important for geopolitical reasons. Although Africa, according to many organizations, including the World Bank, represents a very promising future in the 21st century, later in the 21st century, in terms of economic growth potential. China is setting roots, has already set roots there early. It has extended billions in loans. And it has a base in Africa. And both the Europeans as well as the United States have in mind the reality that the BRICS group is growing and that it's powerful. And South Africa is more loyal to China. And of course, BRICS includes Russia. And that was also part of the tension and part of the reason that the Trump administration went after South Africa in the manner that Trump did, although Ramaphosa later said that in the private discussions, he was there to talk trade, considering that his country, by the way, has suffered enormously because of Trump's tariffs. South Africa is an exporter of minerals. It's an exporter of gold, diamonds, all sorts of minerals, but also agricultural products, by the way. Major agricultural products. The Afrikaners are the big producers of those agricultural products. The blacks work for the Afrikaners in South Africa. So what we have here is a situation where the president of South Africa went there to talk trade, and to see if he can get better terms to stimulate trade with the United States. That was that in itself represented leverage for the Trump administration. He took advantage of that and said, wait a minute, you're pursuing neoliberal pluralism and diversity neoliberalism, which Trump is against, given what he has been doing, by the way, since he came to office in the last 5 months, from January to May, with regard to policies that cut programs that have to do with diversity and fairness and equity. So he was basically sending a message to the neoliberal pluralists in South Africa, but also the world, that the authoritarian neoliberal model that the United States is pursuing was the one that the US expected South Africa to pursue, and it did not want South Africa to hinder the interests of the Afrikaners in the manner that it has, although within the neoliberal structure, all the South African government has been doing is to try to grow the economy by integrating more blacks, making many more of them capitalists, by the way. Trump had already decided to punish South Africa earlier than Ramaphosa at his meeting. In February 2025, when a court in South Africa found that the accusation by some Afrikaner groups, and some of the richest, by the way, some of the billionaires and those include some of the billionaires and multimillionaires in the small Jewish community. By the way, the Jewish community in South Africa is very small but very influential. It's connected to the De Beers Corporation, the Diamond Corporation. It's connected to the gold and diamonds industry historically. Very influential community, and some of the Jewish community elements had been pressuring Ramaphosa to be more pro-Israel. They argued pro-Jewish, less anti-Semitic. His argument had been that there is genocide being committed in Gaza, and they were saying by arguing that there's genocide, what you're doing is being anti-Semitic. In other words, the exact same line as the US government, whether Biden or Trump. No difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's all one. So although Jewish scholars themselves would be the first to maintain that there's a huge difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So that is to be considered, that there are very wealthy individuals in South Africa, part of the Jewish community, that had been pressuring Ramaphosa, and very influential people, by the way, on the side of Trump on this one. And so in February, however, the South African court, found that there is no evidence. It's just all manufactured for white genocide. That's the same month, February 2025, that Trump ended aid to South Africa. And then in March, he announced that he was so outraged by white genocide in South Africa that he would allow the first group of refugees to come to the United States, 59 of them. And the question, of course, that Africans all over the continent asked: whites from Africa, refugees, not from the Sudan, really? Not from Palestinian lands? So this is sort of a turning the tables on those who argued against apartheid and against racism, whether it was in Israel at the expense of the Palestinians or in the rest of the continent. The Trump administration was also not happy with the ambassador that the President Ramaphosa appointed, and refused to accept the ambassador. Finally, the ambassador had to withdraw. South African ambassador had to withdraw. I listened to a videotape of his where he explained that he was only delivering the message of the government, which, by the way, is a government that includes all elements of society, not just blacks. Let's remember, I want to emphasize this point. Ramaphosa is a multimillionaire. His wife is also very wealthy, comes from one of the wealthiest black families in Africa. Ramaphosa has embraced neoliberalism, but pluralism version of neoliberalism, and that is allow pluralism within neoliberalism. After all, this is a country that had suffered apartheid for decades, official apartheid for decades, and then, of course, before that, it was a colonial regime. So the idea of pursuing authoritarian neoliberalism by a black majority government would have been unthinkable. There would have been a revolution in South Africa. So this is an individual, Ramaphosa, trying to keep the interests of the white elites, a few blacks who are wealthy, and then the vast majority who are blacks, 82%, who unfortunately own just 15% of the land, while 7% of the population were whites, own 72% of the land. So the 7% that Trump was concerned about, the Afrikaners, that he invited to be part of the refugee group, apparently victims of white genocide in South Africa. These people, that is this group of people, in a country of 65 million people, by the way, just 7% are white. And that 7% on 72% of the land, while 82% of the black population owns 15%. That's the kind of inequity that Ramaphosa was trying to address. He, by the way, being a multimillionaire married to a multimillionaire wife. So what we're talking about here is how far do we stretch the neoliberal model before there is a revolution. Now, let me point out, by the way, just for the record, that does, and I already addressed this issue, that South Africa does have a violence problem. I have seen many documentaries on gun violence and murders in South Africa. It is one of the worst cases in the world. The vast majority, in fact, 99% killed are non-white. Only 1% is white. That constitutes genocide, according to some. That 1%. And the motives have nothing to do with violence. The motives are that when you have endemic poverty, when you have 55 to 70% poverty of the majority population, which is 82%, when you have that sort of poverty, and within that group, 25% or 14 million people trying to secure their food for the day, when you have that sort of poverty, you're going to have violence. Criminologists and sociologists and political philosophers, the great Cesare Beccaria, who wrote of crime and punishments, the standard that influenced many thinkers from the 18th century, from the Enlightenment era to present day criminologists, have argued that there is a direct link between crime and poverty. Impoverished people turn to crime. The reason that prisons, not just in South Africa, but all over the world, in the United States included, by the way, are filled with poor people and minority people, both in South Africa and the United States. In the case of South Africa, by the way, that's the majority. The black population is the majority. It's because that's the population that's mostly exploited economically. That's the population that the state doesn't safeguard economically. Because the state, the neoliberal state, especially right now in the last 45 years that we've been living in, safeguards the interests of the capitalist class, especially big capital. And the question again is, and I can see it, Ramaphosa, of course, arguing, where do we go? I mean, because he is pressured in his own government. The opposition includes a small political party that is leftist, and it advocates not the killing of whites, but the killing of white privilege. In other words, the elimination of white privilege. This is not that different when you take out the heated rhetoric. The heated rhetoric aside, when you take that aside, this is not that different than what the French revolutionaries were demanding in 1789 when they were saying what they wanted an end to the privileged orders, to the aristocracy and the upper clergy. And they wanted to bring equality and fairness in society for all people, not just for the top 3% of the population. This is not that different. Human beings are the same all over the world. They want social justice, and social justice is what's lacking in South Africa, despite the Nelson Mandela political revolution, which brought black majority rule, the African National Congress, to office. That's fine. It did. Symbolically, very important. Blacks became very proud that there was a Nelson Mandela, a black hero, finally, in their own land, conquered by the Dutch and the English since the 16th century. So what we have here is, in fact, in the White House, an attempt to overlook at history and empirical evidence, and to try to use, evidently, according to mainstream media, videotape as well as photographs that even, by the way, after the Trump-Ramaphosa meeting, some Afrikaners themselves said, yes, these crosses have nothing to do. There are no graves there. They're memorials. And again, this is the importance of knowing at least some cultural history. If the people at the White House had known that this is a tradition going back 1,000 years, Europeans have been doing this, and in some places of Africa, they continued, considering Europeans who colonized Africa and Christianized Africa, went down there and Christianized Africa. So they continued that. So these crosses did not represent graves, they represent memorials of victims of violence, because there is endemic poverty. And there's an endemic poverty in a country that has 33% unemployment rate, and youth unemployment twice that, by the way. And there are youth involved in drugs, human trafficking, guns, anything illegal, armed robbery. That's the motive. It has nothing to do with genocide. And the question here is, of course, turning this issue into racializing this issue in reverse racism. This is popular in a number of countries, going against the minorities, whether it's Muslims, whether it's Arabs, whether it's blacks, going against them and saying, you're the racist for not allowing me, right, who has control of the institutional structure and the state, to pursue policies that best suit the interests of the elites. That's essentially what the Trump administration was saying. And like I said, this is a continuation of what's going on inside the United States, with policies designed to punish institutions that pursue equity, fairness, and diversity. The issue, and of course, using the issue of anti-Semitism at Harvard University, where the president is Jewish, by the way, and insists there is no anti-Semitism. That's not the issue here. It's academic freedom, and it's abiding by the Constitution, by the First Amendment of the Constitution. And there are all sorts of congressmen and senators who side with Harvard University, as though Harvard University, by the way, here's one institution, and I had friends who worked there when I was in higher education. Harvard University is an institution that has been historically absorbing the elites. That's where the presidents and ministers and so forth, and the richest people send their children. It is not a factory, and some Republican called it an overpriced indoctrination factory for the left. It's actually just the opposite. Look at who has come out of Harvard. Some of the worst dictators in history. Some of the most authoritarian elements. It's the idea that Harvard is some kind of a hotbed of left-wing politics. Harvard is simply trying to preserve its integrity as an institution, providing academic freedom and permitting voices of dissent, as any democratic society would. And President Ramaphosa is trying, although neoliberal to the core, although one of the wealthiest men in Africa, he is intelligent enough to know that you can only go so far before there is a revolution. If he goes too far, there's already an endemic poverty problem in South Africa. And like I said, depending on the source, by the way, 55 to 70% of the Black population at or below poverty. And here we have an administration in Washington saying, squeeze something more out of them. Instead of saying, well, let's help them, cutting off aid to South Africa, accepting white Afrikaners, the privileged elite, accepting them to the United States as refugees, accept them all they want. That's not the issue, but as refugees, running away from what? Now, it is true that South Africa has evolved, and it is not the white heaven it was before Nelson Mandela, where the whites were literally the masters. It's not the same South Africa. However, the wealth of the country is overwhelmingly, something like 3/4 of the entire wealth of the country is in the hand of 7% of the population, mostly whites. And then within that group, by the way, there are a number of very influential multimillionaires and billionaires who are linked to Musk and Trump. And that's what influenced the policy. That's what influenced the Trump rhetoric. And I should also point out, by the way, that using the issue of genocide and anti-Semitism, again, is consistent with what the Trump administration is doing. But Biden did the same thing, by the way. Biden actually started all of this because the war in Gaza started under Biden, not under Trump. So what we have here is a situation where there is consistency in policy in using anti-Semitism as a pretext, as the president of Harvard pointed out correctly, and many, many scholars have pointed out correctly. Jewish scholars, by the way, let alone non-Jewish scholars, using that issue as a pretext to pursue far right-wing policies that are in fact a distraction from the class warfare, whether inside the United States or in South Africa. Now, this is not to excuse, and I know that maybe I have come across as someone who supports Ramaphosa, but I actually feel that South Africa, in spite of its progress in terms of securing Black majority rule, has not made progress. Its GDP growth has been very flat in the last 10, 15 years, averaging around 1%. In spite of the fact that it's part of the BRICS group, in spite of the fact that it's on the right side when it comes to issues like genocide in Israel. Genocide in Israel is where the world, look at the the United Nations General Assembly sentiment. That's where you get the sentiment of world governments. Look at the public opinion on a world scale, what they think. It's not just him. It's not just South Africa. It's most of the world. So the issue here is that the government of South Africa is lacking. It has a record to defend, and that record is a record of neoliberalism, not a record of social justice that has lifted the Black population suffering endemic poverty rates among the worst in the world. In a country, by the way, that is so rich in diamonds, in gold, in agricultural land, a country so rich in resources, natural resources. A country, by the way, that has a viable secondary sector of production, that is the manufacturing sector, right? A country that also has a thriving sector in high tech. A country that's trying to bring in more. That's one of the reasons Ramaphosa was in Washington. He talked to a number of executives. A country that is trying to modernize, to bring in more high-tech companies, more investment. In fact, I believe that Ramaphosa also spoke or had some contact with Musk, and he wants to smooth that out and see what compromises Musk will make. So the government of South Africa has a long ways to go to address the inequities of society. This is a country that is very important, along with Nigeria, by the way. Two countries in Africa, South Africa and Nigeria, the most important countries, both very rich in natural resources. In the case of Nigeria, oil, of course. And yet, vast number of people, a large percentage of the population, suffering endemic poverty. Now, I want to conclude this by pointing out that um, the villain in all of this, in the Trump-Ramaphosa meeting, is really the neoliberal system. It's the neoliberal model. That is what has tragically driven people into poverty, because Nelson Mandela came to office in 1994 at a time that neoliberalism was flourishing on a world scale. And one of the ways that he became accepted to the white minority that owned the means of production, that owned most of the wealth, by far most of the wealth in that country, was because the power sought was at the political level, and that the state would serve the white elites owning the means of production. So this is a very important issue to consider, that the government that comes in, the African National Congress government under Nelson Mandela in the 1990s during the Clinton era, that comes in is a government that, yes, is symbolically very important. It represents a lot for the end of apartheid. However, it was not the end of social injustice for 82% of the population that is black. And the meeting between Ramaphosa and Donald Trump was really a meeting, a clash of a neoliberal model that is pluralistic to on one side that Ramaphosa supported, and on the other side the authoritarian neoliberal model that Trump advocated. I want to end it there. I want to thank you very much for joining me. Write questions, join this channel, and stay tuned for more sessions, analytical sessions about world events. Thank you very much.